Welcome to the New Mexico Military Museum podcast, where we uncover powerful and often untold stories from history and those who bring them to life. Today, we are honored to share the story of Thomas Vernon Louie Long, a soldier who fought in one of the most brutal theaters of World War II, the Philippines. His story, marked by courage, sacrifice, and loss, continues to resonate with his family and the greater veteran community. Louie was among the thousands who endured the Battle of Bataan, the infamous Bataan Death March, and imprisonment at Cabanatuan, where he ultimately perished. Joining us today are Julia Boyce and Tommy St. Peters, who have worked to uncover and preserve Louie's story. Before we dive into this incredible journey, I'd love to start by hearing from you both about your connections to him. Please tell us more about yourselves and what led you to explore Louie's history.
Julie, you want to go first?
Well, no, I think you should because you're older than me and because you started this before I did.
Okay, well, I'm 81 years old, and be 82 in December. And of course, all of this happened, his death happened, and him serving all before I was born. So it's been quite some time. I grew up mostly in New Mexico, Carlsbad, and was born in Portales, New Mexico, where my family moved around a lot when I was first born. And then when I first got interested in this, basically, I heard bits and pieces and remember seeing flowers and stuff in 1947 or 48, I can't remember which, when they had a memorial service and they brought somebody else's body and they buried in our family plot in Portales, New Mexico. But I was only 4 years old then, so I don't remember a whole lot from that. But when my grandmother, we called her Mama, died in the early 1980s, her oldest daughter, Grace Kent, asked me what I wanted to keep from Mama, and I said I want the picture and all the stuff she has about Louie, because I was so impressed with what he did in World War II, and I wanted to take care of it. Now, mind you, I was 40 years old this time, and so she gave me the picture, and it's a 3D picture that she had made, and a folder full of letters and pictures that they had from the first funeral, which turned out not to be Louie in the grave. And then I did some research. I ordered 3 or 4 books and found out all I could about him. And then years later, when I was around 78 or 79, the group from the Army in Hawaii contacted me and my aunt, Jean Sawyer, and asked us for DNA so that they could use it to identify soldiers that they were recovering from mass graves. And I didn't expect to hear anything from that, but surprisingly we did. And that's basically where we're at.
Julia, you want to take a turn, introduce yourself?
My name is Julia Boyce. I am Tommy's sister, Vernon's niece. I was born in 1954, and so I'm 11 years younger than Tommy. So all of my knowledge about Vernon, you all are calling him Louie, I have Louie, is through my mother and a few of my aunts. Louie was one of 7 children, and he was the only boy. So there are lots of sisters, and my mother was right in the middle of those 7. She was, I think, child number 5. I was less aware of him until, I knew about him, but I didn't know a whole lot. I knew he had died in World War II. As I got older, I heard about the Bataan March and that he was part of that. The thing that I remember in trying to talk to my mother about Louie was that she was kind of hesitant to say much. it was a painful memory. And I remember anytime, as I and we have a younger sister, Kathy, anytime we were watching TV and a military movie or show came on, Mom would usually get up and leave the room. And I asked her one time why, and she said, because it makes me think about Louie. So I live in Dallas, Texas now, and I have been really into genealogy and stuff. And so Tommy and I started talking and sharing stuff as I was doing research. And then when all of the DNA events happened, it just sort of exploded for me. This whole interest in finding out as much about Louis as we possibly could. Both Tommy and I had visited the New Mexico Military Museum in Santa Fe and seen his picture up on the wall and his story. This was before they had found his actual remains. So he's been part of my consciousness much more now as a 70-year-old than when I was younger. So that's how I have been exploring his history.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that family connection is always a common key that we find here at the New Mexico Military Museum. Um, so, as I understand it, as part of our new exhibit release, some letters have been included, and you guys were kind
Mhm.
enough to forward those letters along. What was some of the most interesting things that you guys discovered while searching through these records and finding these various correspondence between him and his family during his early time in the Philippines?
Uh, oh, mainly there was a letter from a girl in college, and that was interesting. I can't remember her name. Maybe Julie can. And there were several other,
Anna Jean Rawlings.
and there were several other letters to my grandmother and grandfather that he wrote, and they were interesting to read about his. He always seemed to put a fairly good light on what he was doing in the Philippines. And the other part was, being a member of the football team at A&M and going to the A&M college. Almost all the guys joined the National Guard. And of course, the National Guard was one of the first units called up to be sent out. I think they went to Fort Bliss and learned how to be a coastal artillery unit. The 200th that went over to Philippines, and it was split into two groups. The 515th broke off from the 200th, and Louie was part of the 515th. And all of that was real interesting.
I found the letter from Anna Jean is very poignant. She wrote to my grandmother after my uncle's first service, which was I think 1949 when they buried him, something like that. And she went. One of the most poignant things is she writes in her letter that the last letter she had received from Louie said, "Promise me that as soon as I get back to the States, I can have a date with you." So she wrote my grandmother and said, "So I drove to Portales for his service so I could keep the date with Louie that I promised," which is very, very poignant. But as far as his letters home, I kind of categorized them in chronological order. And it's really interesting to see him go from a pretty upbeat to, more and more frustrated as time went on. he writes back and tells us what it's like in the Philippines, what the people are like, and different. And we, because everybody was from that area of New Mexico, they kind of all knew each other. In fact, one of Louie's sisters, our Aunt Inez, was married to a gentleman named Bill McGee, I believe it was. And Bill and his brother Tommy were there with Vernon, with Louie in the Philippines, and he saw them periodically. And so there was this sort of, you know, tell Inez I saw, Bill, and he's doing okay. I mean, so there was a lot of that. But what really caught my attention was where he said, this was November of 1941. He said, things are getting awfully monotonous here. We're still doing the same thing we did the first 2 months at Fort Bliss. I got mad and turned my truck driver's card in on Saturday. I wasn't supposed to drive in the first place. So what you see is soldiers sitting there in the Philippines, not really knowing exactly why they're there and sort of doing nothing and waiting and waiting and waiting, which I think was really frustrating for them. So I learned a lot from his letters, and they had this expectation that they were going to be home by January. That's what they were being told. So I think that was a difficult thing. And one of the letters he talks about that himself and some of the guys that had been there for a while were given 100 extra rounds of ammo. But the new guys that had just arrived weren't given any extra ammo. And so they knew something was about to happen. They just didn't know what. So anyway, I learned a lot about sort of the chronological thing. The last letter from Louie was December 6, 1941. And once the battle started and then the march, he was not heard from again.
Yeah, correct. And as we now understand, decades later, he was uh, caught up in the ultimate surrender of Bataan, and part of the tens of thousands of Americans and Filipino soldiers who were um, kind of carted off in the Bataan Death March, and for some uh, the groups were split into two parts. One half was sent off via train to various prison camps across uh, the Philippines, while others, including Louis, were carted off to Cabanatuan, I believe. And so it was just a horrific series of events that, unfortunately, due to rampant disease, Louis did not survive that. As we've already discussed to an extent, there was a misidentification with Louis's remains initially due to the mass grave sites that were established during this time by the Japanese. And so, uh, maybe you guys can talk a little bit more about what it was like getting these correspondence, years after this took place, saying that there's a possibility that that there might have been a mistake with it, and then they're trying to correct the identification and make sure the actual individual was returned home.
May I make a point before we discuss that?
Sure.
Well, I just think it's important for people to understand that these brave boys, mostly farm boys from the country, were sent over there with old equipment, much of it military equipment, much of it left over from World War I, were not given enough ammunition, and when the battles began, had no air or sea support. They were on their own with very little to help them fight this war. And I just want people to understand how incredibly brave it must have been for them. They kept thinking they were going to have support, that airplanes were going to come over and bomb and give them some backup. It never happened. And so I just think that's really important to know that these guys, they gave it all and were put out in front with little or nothing to win that war, that battle.
No,
So I just
absolutely.
wanted to point that out.
No, that's definitely an important factor of this story, and recognizing the situation that they were in and the bravery and courage that they exhibited, despite the the ferocity of their enemy and the sheer impossibility of their situation. It was just incredible
Yeah,
shows of courage and bravery on those boys' parts, for sure.
absolutely.
Okay, so uh, continuing on from there, did you guys have any other thoughts about the imprisonment camps or the battles or anything like that that you wanted to add in here?
Oh, I think I've read in these books, and I've got to the point where I'm not sure these books are accurate, but the trials they went on through the Death March, where people were shot and killed for falling behind, and people like Louie, who was a football player and very physically fit, were able to make it, but eventually the disease and poor food and stuff that they received in these prison camps took a toll on their lives.
Yeah.
No, it was definitely a horrible, horrible place to be.
So you were asking about what it was like when we heard that. Well, Tommy can respond because he's the one that got the letter asking for his DNA. He and my aunt Billie Jean, who's still alive, by the way. Louis' youngest sister is still alive. She's 97, lives in Arizona, and so it's incredible that we still have one of the original siblings that's still with us. So, but she got the letter along with Tommy, and I'll let Tommy tell you that part.
Sure.
I received the notice. They sent me an email and told me all about it, and said they would be sending me a kit to put my saliva in and mail back. And I was surprised about all of this. I was not surprised. Well, I wasn't surprised. What I'm trying to say is, I'd heard from different family members that they didn't really think the remains were him and all of that over the years, but they had no way to prove it. They were given instructions not to open the casket when it arrived. So I think, the way I understand it, the casket was full of sacks of remains. It wasn't a body. And so there was no real way it would be worth opening the casket. But it did have his dog tags took to the outside of it. And I think they took the tags when they resumed the body that was there. They took the dog tags off of the casket and gave to Billie Jean, the younger sister. But anyway, it was not surprising that they asked for it. I was very surprised that they found his remains and were sending him home. So that was a total shock for me.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been an ongoing project in connection with the New Mexico Military Museum and the DNA testing centers out in Honolulu to try and identify all of the remaining unknown soldiers from New Mexico, and it's an incredible step forward in technology that we can take these individuals and repatriate them to their families and bring that closure that may not have fully set in. You know, as you're saying, there were family members who suspected that the individual you that they had buried wasn't um, uh, their relative as they were told, and so I imagine this brought a great deal of closure to the family, knowing that they had their brother, their uncle, their friend, uh, given the proper respect and um, services in recognition of his services.
They did a really nice job with the new funeral that we had. I guess that was last year, wasn't it, Julie?
It was 2023.
2023. 4 times passing fast.
I'm not. Well, I would like to say that number one, I really appreciate the work that's done in Honolulu by the labs that do all of the work. And we have to remind ourselves that at the end of the war, we didn't have DNA technology. We had no way of identifying bodies really, other than the dog tags. And if they got separated from the soldier, it was just, and also the government wasn't given access to many of these mass graves for many years. So I just feel like, people they recognized that the people back home needed some way to have closure. They needed a casket to put in the ground, if you will, to say, I've buried my son, you know.
Yeah.
So they sent caskets, and whatever they were filled with was what they were filled with. And everybody was told, don't open them, you know. And so it was very emotional to find out that they had found him now based on DNA. They knew it, these bones were, and they even, Tommy helped me remember, I think they even identified, they had some of his molars, they identified the specific bones that they had.
Yeah, they did.
And they said, based on what was in those bones, we know how he died. He died of encephalitis of the brain brought on by malaria in the prison camp hospital. So, all that stuff Tommy had been reading in some of the books, our memories do tricks on us after so many years. And you think somebody is somebody else, and you tell a story and it's not really them. And so I think it's important for us to set the record straight for Louie's sake and for his memory. So that's part of why this is so exciting, is to be able to set the record straight.
No, absolutely. And from our previous conversations, I believe he received some special honors on the delivery of the casket before the second funeral, correct?
The way his body was, his casket was so lovingly and respectfully cared for by American Airlines and by all the people at the airports and DFW and in Albuquerque. It was just amazing. And yeah, that the people really did. People seem to understand how big a deal it was to find somebody's remains and bring them home. I think people understand that's a very big thing. So the
Absolutely.
work that group does is very amazing.
No, absolutely. It was an incredible an incredibly lucky finding on Tommy's part that we can integrate that into the release and of Louis' exhibit, and drawing attention to the work that has been done, is continuing to be done to make sure that families all across New Mexico and the greater United States that we are continuing to work to identify these individuals and bring that closure and honor to their families long after these people have passed, and continuing to honor their memories. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Echoes of Valor. We hope you enjoyed learning about the incredible stories that shaped New Mexico's military legacy. Be sure to follow us on social media for updates, behind the scenes content, and more exclusive stories. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly Twitter, at NM Military Museum. For more information, please visit our website at www.nmmilitarymuseum.org or stop by and see us in person at 1050 Old Pecos Trail, Santa Fe, New Mexico, 87505. Until next time, keep honoring our veterans and stay connected for more Echoes of Valor.